Good morning and welcome back to the Isle of Faces. Welcome for part 2 of A Feast for Crows, Scraps and Scrolls, our companion podcast. The History of Westeros is Valar Revelis. I'm sure you are listening along on the Sunday streams. Welcome, hello. Come to the Isle. It is a very sunny place. I'm happy to report I'm talking to you from, yes, the very sunny England. Thank you, England, for your blue skies. I am Sir Buckley, your head green person here on the Isle. I will be taking you through our second part of A Feast for Crows today. 4 chapters. We're into our usual format now. We're really getting going. And I'm not sure when you'll be listening to this. We've had some delays from last week with everything going on. But whenever you're listening, we thank you all the same. And a special thank you, as always, to our patrons, especially for those. Many of you sent very, very kind, supportive messages last week about delaying the episodes to this week and everything else. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart, everyone who messaged, everyone who's a patron anyway. I'd especially like to say thank you to KM, as always, for her particular support. Now, I could do the usual of reminding you that the Storm's End episode is oncoming and everything else is going on. I would rather just direct your attention to the one podcast we did release last week. It was 7 minutes long, maybe. It was the Black Lives Matter Resources podcast, in which basically explained why we had no episodes last week, why we had the delay. I briefly went through a list, just outlined a list that I copied and pasted with permission from Girls Can Canon. Thank you again for formulating that, and everyone who obviously contributed the resources listed therein. I would say I advise, instead, I demand that you will pause this, go and listen to that first, because there are much more important things than A Feast for Crows going on currently in our society and on our planet. So, yeah, big stuff still going on. The movement is not dying. We're not going to let it go. A lot of things still need to be fixed. Progress has been made, for sure, but not enough. Always more, always more. Do not stop asking. Do not stop demanding. Well done to all of you out there. And I also realise, shamefully, I've been lax the last couple of podcasts in thanking our tireless key workers still out there, healthcare professionals, everyone else still fighting the virus. My apologies, we have not forgotten you. I know how much work you are still doing protecting us, even as people are maybe a bit too fast to forget that. Everyone still working hard. We salute you here on the Isle. I hope, perhaps, if you're listening to this, I can provide some comfort or some repayment for your hard work and your sacrifices. With that, let's get on today, shall we? I hope you've gone back, listened to that podcast. Please do before we go any further. But going today, like I say, we're into our normal format today, not just in terms of recording, but also in terms of what we are covering and the reading experience, because we're back with people we know. Yeah, people we've actually seen before, POVs we've actually had before, and places that are familiar to us. Not like last week at all. That was a rather large enigma, an outlier there, which we will come across again. There's plenty more of that to come, but not so much this week. Let me quickly tell you what chapters we have coming. We begin with Cersei I. We go on to Brienne I, Sam I, and Arya I. So right away, we know all these people. This is a big turnaround. We're getting that thing that we wanted last week, the follow-up to Tyrion's plotline. We're going to see, where has Arya gone? We had some hints, but we really want to know what's going up on the wall. That's our one glimpse. That's good. And wow, okay, we get Brienne's opening quest. I'm going to enjoy talking about that one. So there's a lot of aftermath in that. What has happened now that Jon is Lord Commander? What is going to happen now that we find Tywin is dead? Okay, we don't find that specifically out today, but it all begins. So there's follow-up from Storm of Swords, but there's also the opening of new storylines. And it actually comes in pairs, because we've got the beginning of 2 journeys in Sam and Brienne, going not particularly similar directions at all, or similar motivations, but 2 journeys nonetheless. And we've got 2 cities that we're going to settle into. One, King's Landing, which we already know, but it's a very different King's Landing. And we find Braavos, which we're going to be in for this book and the next book. Not very often, but we are for both Arya and Sam. And who knows who else going forward, possibly more. So that's very important. Obviously, a lot of setup for going forward, because we've also got 2 new POVs. It's very exciting. I spoke about it last week, so I won't repeat myself too much. But Brienne and Cersei, the 2 big guns of this book. Personally, I find you could throw Jaime in there, but I think when most people think of Feast for Crows, they think of Brienne and they think of Cersei, especially Cersei, just because she's so out there, very hard to ignore. So we're really looking forward to getting going with those plot lines. Not to say that Sam's isn't important. That's wonderful. We spoke about that a lot last week. And we have to adjust to a very different Arya, both as a character and in how often we get to see her and what's going on. But we'll get to that as we go. The only other thing I want to talk about here in the intro is something I didn't get to last week, and it's this idea that Feast for Crows, and I think we'll see a bit of this today, is very much the bill being paid from Storm of Swords. Well, from the first 3 books entirely, from the War of the Five Kings. We're going to see it with the Faith walking to the city. We're going to see it in the crown and the court kind of being hollowed out step by step. It's not as simple as just seeing devastated village number 50. We've seen plenty of that already with Arya and Jaime and various other people. Now we're really seeing everything that's been built up, everything that Tywin did, mainly, in the centre of the kingdoms. That's all got to be paid back, and we're going to see that both out on the road with Brienne and also in the court, like I say, because this is very, very different to what we're used to. But I think probably the best way is just to get down to it and actually have a look at these chapters. So let's begin. Yes, I know you've been waiting. Finally, for Cersei I. Okay, let's just take a moment, everybody, shall we, to just appreciate that we are here, that I can say Cersei I. I maintain that out of the first 3 books, the person you would want most as a POV would be Cersei. I really do. Maybe not so much at the end of Game of Thrones as well, but definitely in A Clash for Kings. I still say that's the real one I would have loved to see through her viewpoint. All the instructions of Tyrion and the Blackwater and Myrcella being taken away and Joffrey being awful, everything. Not that we would turn down Storm of Swords either, but we are here. We actually get to be in the mind of this woman who has been the antagonist so far. I spoke last week about Cersei being very much the focus of this book. Like I say, we're all desperate for her. But she's also leading the way for the plot that most people want to know about, like I also, again, mentioned last week. Tyrion was left on a cliffhanger in Storm. So we need to know the aftermath. I've got these Iron Islands, I've got Sunspear to deal with. What's happened to Tyrion? What's happened to King's Landing? I've spent so much time being invested there. Please, pay it off, George. And George, he accepts, he gives us that here today. That was the big event of the South in the ending of that book. The Red Wedding, sure, okay, but that was like halfway through the book. And yes, Lady Stoneheart came back, but that's kind of secret for now. This is the big thing. This is the ripple that's going to go out all the way through this book, and Dan's also. So we need to see it. We need to see that beginning. George denied us. He managed to deny us for 3 whole chapters, but now relents. And not only relents, but gives it to us in a Cersei type package. Wow. I can't imagine what a feeling it must have been to see that chapter title for the first time, for first-time readers. At the beginning of Storm, we spoke a lot about the weighty decision and hard road it was to make Jaime into a POV, how difficult it was considering all the build-up of Jaime as a classic Disney villain. And that was with someone who had barely been on the page for an entire book and a half, who'd been in the Riverrun dungeons for the majority of the series at that point. Whereas Cersei has been the prominent antagonist for us so far. Peter Baelish, still the largest, still the worst, in my opinion, and I'm right. The others, obviously, are still there, okay. Euron is coming, but Cersei is the one we know best. She's the one who's been on the most pages, she's the one we've had to hear from the most, she is just there, in our face. She is the one we've hated the most. At least now that Joffrey is gone, okay. Fair enough, Joffrey might have taken that title. And he would be the only rival. If we were going to pick characters who were like, How could they possibly be turned into a POV? Okay, I agree, Joffrey would be a harder character to turn into a POV, but Cersei's probably next in line. Obviously, George did enjoy the experience with Jaime and wanted to do it again, even if Cersei does go down a completely different route to her twin. This is not comparable arcs of these two, in my opinion. In fairness, because we spent so much time with her, it also means we've had some more sympathy and understanding drummed up. Not a lot, but a bit. More so than we had with Jaime, anyway. We've seen her be a mother. We know of her abusive marriage. We know it's not as clean cut as this is just a bad person for no reason. She's not a Joffrey. And Joffrey had some reasons. Not as many as Cersei. But we've also seen her condemn Tyrion through a mock trial. Although, we'll say it's understandable why she thought it was him. Valonqar theory or no Valonqar theory. We've seen her be abusive to Sansa. We know she killed Robert and obviously played a huge, gigantic part in Ned's fall and death. Plus, like 1,000 other instances with lesser characters of having people beaten or whipped or killed or whatever. She's not a nice person. We know that. She's been the most consistent evil so far. And now we get to share this new world that we find ourselves in with her. So that's amazing. It's a fascinating point of view, isn't it? It's not one we've really had before. A woman ascending to power. The power, essentially. We've already had Ned and Tyrion trying to control King's Landing. Okay, we kind of had a break from that in Storm because we didn't have Tywin, but now we see it through Cersei's eyes, and she has the power. Everything she's wanted, kind of, which we're going to discuss in a minute because that's how she opens this book. And for all the jokes and hilarity of how badly Cersei messes it up, to put that aside, there is also incredibly strong writing within this arc about the great unbalance of gender power in this world, and Cersei trying to repay that debt and her interactions with her sexuality, with those power dynamics. And well, we're going to have a lot of fun discussing this, I think, as we go through these 10 chapters I believe she gets. Yeah, it's pretty dominating. And there's many, many other unfairnesses that she has faced in her time, so we will address those as we go. To me, Cersei is stepping into the gap left by Catelyn's death and her departure as a POV. They have always been mirror images of each other since the beginning. They are the two matriarchs of our two families, Lannisters versus Starks. That's a pretty central column to our plot so far. Both of them have been willing to do whatever it takes to protect their children. They are mothers. Okay, we've seen it more physically on Catelyn's side, but Cersei has not exactly been lax in that area either. They've both been mothers to kings, and now we get to see Cersei step outside that role and really get hungry for her own power. She almost brushes Tommen aside in this book and starts using him as anyone else would, even if she can't quite grasp that. Yeah, I'm going to look forward to talking about Tommen a lot. Poor old Tommen in these chapters. So I think this is one of the more famous arcs in Song of Ice and Fire. Like I said, it's going to be a delight to read through and discuss. But we also have the second character, the background, the setting of this chapter, because this is a huge change in King's Landing and in the royal ruling court. It's easily the biggest change since Robert's Rebellion. Yes, we've already had 2 actual kings die, but I don't think this is a comparison. If I'm honest, I think Tywin's death is far more impactful than either Robert or Joffrey. We got almost an entirely new small council, which is almost entirely made up of basically rookies. Some long-standing members of the court that we've just gotten used to are on their way out. The Kingsguard is very different as well. The Tyrells will bloom and then kind of individually wither or leave, and that's without mentioning the faith coming to the city and changing the whole dynamic. The entire city, really, and the stability of the crown grows weaker and weaker, all under Cersei's direction. Not all because of Cersei, but quite a lot of it. She's hungered for this her whole life. She is convinced that she alone can do it, and, unfortunately, utterly messes it up in almost every way. You could say she has essentially won the battle that she's always been fighting, only to find victory is oh so bitter. Quite a bit like Robert. So not only do we find out that Cersei is bad at management, as we've always suspected she would be, but also discover entirely new depths to her depravity and evil. It's easy to forget how we didn't have the whole story at this point. Okay, yeah, we knew she was bad, but we're going to find out more and more. There's the stuff of Qyburn, the manipulation of certain people, and how willing she is to just sacrifice people, treat them as things. There's definite sociopathic behaviour and several other types going on here. There's the memories of past evils that we didn't even know of if she relates that to us as well. And she does get worse in this book, as if we could have imagined such a thing. And it all ends up with comeuppance. Who could have guessed? We'll come to that much later. What is Cersei's biggest role in this book? She is what Tywin Lannister left the world. She is the product of his approach to life that we quickly mentioned last week. This is the rotting lion, the legacy. She is a product of his approach to life. She is the rotting lion. It's Tywin's legacy against the brilliance that we've already seen and will see against Ned's. This is what evil gets you, basically. Cersei is merely a golden crow, picking off the leftovers and doing nothing with them except make it all worse because she wants to preen in the mirror. And the opening page confirms it for us with her dream. Here's the first quote. She dreamt she sat the Iron Throne, high above them all. Not exactly news to us, but we're beginning with Cersei's goal. Power. She's been denied her agency, denied what she thinks is deserved, her whole life. So, logically, she still wants it. She is still power hungry. Remember, she still believes Tywin alive at this point, so it's not just opportunity knocking. It's the undercurrent. This is always what she's thinking of. This is her motivation for Robert, for Ned, for Tyrion, and still now, even if she's not going to try and usurp Tywin anytime soon. In waking life, she allows her sons to sit the actual throne, but she still wants the power for herself because it's always been denied. And the second clause of that quote is crucial. She doesn't want to rule to effect change or to have people love her, specifically. She just wants to be above them all. She believes herself better. Again, setting that prevailing theme of the book is the highborn being high above the lowborn, and again, comeuppance coming from that. That ties in nicely to the other thing that she can't let go of in Feast. Yes, there's power, but there's also Tyrion. In much the same way that we'll find out Tyrion can't let go of Cersei in Dance, Cersei fixates and has constant paranoia about her younger brother all the way throughout this book. We've been present for so much of their conflict with Clash and Storm, but obviously everything took a huge step forward with Joffrey's death. And now we're about to get Tywin on top of that as well, and the fact that Tyrion escapes, so you can kind of understand the paranoia. The amount of things that Cersei will attribute to Tyrion throughout this book is a bit of a sign of Cersei's mental state that we should probably get used to now. In this dream, she thinks of the courtiers as brightly coloured mice, but she is always the lion. Again, that's the imagery of her always believing herself better, she is a class above. It's funny how Cersei's concern in this dream is very similar to Tyrion's, being laughed at and mocked by the assembled court. So we can see some of Tywin's teachings in there. You must never be laughed at. You must always be a cut above and always respected. And, well, we know why Tywin thought that way. So we can see that being passed on to his next generation. And in that same way, there's lots of foreshadowing to her walk of shame because she dreams of being nude in front of everyone and getting cuts from the throne, etc., etc. So that's a dark link to what's going to happen later on. But there's also the larger symbolism of it being the Iron Throne that cuts her, because we know there's the idea of if the throne cuts you, it rejects you. We saw it with Joffrey, so now Cersei is dreaming it. Cersei, we do know, is going to be unworthy of her position. So dream's over, Cersei wakes, and who's she being woken by? Sanel. Poor Sanel. We meet the first of Cersei's many, many victims in this book. She really does pile them up, especially at the end, and the majority of them aren't exactly getting clean deaths. Makes it pretty tough on a reread to, well, we know what's going to happen to Sanel and others. Not something we really want to dwell on. And consider, just going forward, the majority of these victims are going to be people on Cersei's side. It's not like she's going out and capturing soldiers from a different army and then doing bad things. These are people, in theory, that are hers. So she really does kind of smash the floor beneath her own feet during this book. Now, to be fair, Cersei wakes up in a room full of shadowed men, and that is terrifying for anyone. She actually handles it pretty well, and especially for a woman in this world, of all worlds. They could have, just waited outside. I'm not sure why not. Just send Sanel in first, not that just surround Cersei in the middle of the night. What do you think she's going to react like? But she channels the lion, she shows her strength straight off. And just consider the history of this castle, of the Red Keep. What has been done in this place by shadowed men at night? Yeah, Cersei does have reason to be like, what the hell are these guys doing here? But I do really like her mistaking Osmond for Jaime, because he is essentially going to be a thin copy for Cersei throughout this book. She's a bit disorientated, she doesn't really know what's going on. We don't actually get the dialogue from these people telling her about Tywin, we just hear mutters about a crossbow, etc. So now readers are really getting excited. That's a cooler way to do it than just have someone tell Cersei outright, because people have been waiting for this a long, long time, and we really want to find out, is it true? Did it really happen? Did Tywin actually die? Can we wrap our minds around that? Yes, please. For rereaders, we know we are going to find out in a second, so we get to be smug about knowing what Cersei doesn't. Which, to be honest, we'll have quite a lot through this book. We know at this moment her confidence is misplaced, and like I said earlier, now we're finally getting what we all wanted. Even if you do like the Ironborn and Dornish plots, I think we agree, we really want to see this scene that's coming up. Quick note before Cersei heads off, she sips at some water with lemon and then spits it out. I wonder if that's a nod to her growing dependence on wine, we're going to focus on that a lot, or perhaps a nod to just show she is the opposite to Sansa, because we know Sansa loves a bit of lemon. Okay, now she's up, she's getting dressed, she knows something has happened, she needs to go and find out what it is. I still like that there's no one moment, at least not yet, of realisation, or that the dialogue didn't come clear to us, like I mentioned. It's slow and it's incremental, she keeps fighting against it for the moment, because, again, this would just be unbelievable to her, so that feels more natural. I like the way George does that. Next up, we get to Cersei's third obsession of this book, the Tyrells. We're already pretty well versed in this from Storm, but again, we're now seeing it from Cersei's actual POV. And it's another marker of that paranoia and kind of her only thinking as far as the nose on her face. We're going to see that a lot in all the decisions she comes up. She really can't expand her mental scope, unfortunately. She attributes nearly everything in this book to one Tyrell or another. If it's not Tyrion, it's a Tyrell normally, or sometimes both. I think she hates them because in many ways it's what the Lannisters should have been. The beautiful queen, the young, skilled knight, or maybe what they were at one point. They even have a cripple in her family. I'm sure in Cersei's mind, Willis and Tyrion are pretty much just the same thing. The Lannisters, they technically had all that, but they hated it. They did not enjoy it. So when she sees these people come up with everything that they should have had, and they're all smiley and loving to each other, yeah, that rubs her the wrong way. Just as an aside, because we don't see them in this chapter, but I really look forward to the Tyrell arc in this book. They become all powerful, then Cersei seems to win and get rid of all of them, only for them to kind of spring back near immediately. And yet we still have the varnish come off of it, the Ironborn raids, the arrest of Marjorie, what the hell is up with Loras, we don't know. So yeah, I look forward to getting to that. Cersei seems to have gained some kind of acceptance by the time she comes to the Tower of the Hand, but she's still keeping her head up high and acting queenly. She's also mentally scheming inside, thinking of how to secure herself and her son. That's fair, can't knock her for that. She's been swept aside or pushed around most of her life, so why wouldn't it happen now? Well, mainly because, ironically, the one who did the majority of sweeping and pushing has just died in the toilet. We have this quote though. She was a daughter of the rock, a lion. Okay, so she's keeping that mentality that this is what she's drawing her strength from, that symbology, that imagery of the lion still being king of the jungle, basically. But she sees an opening and she's going to take it. If Tywin really is dead, if this unimaginable thing has actually happened, okay, how can she take advantage? How can she find a positive? Well, basically because there's no one to tell her no this time. This is the chance for the establishment of power. This is the time for strength. Suddenly there's no husband and no father. Hello. They're the two main influences for all women in Westeros. And she's free of them. So what can she do? What can she get away with? She needs that feeling to offset the less than strong and embarrassing way they actually find Tywin. Because if this kind of thing can happen to him, the person who she would have thought of as the strongest in the world, what can happen to her? What can happen to her children? Next quote. The command came easily to her. My father had steel in his voice as well. So you're already trying on new shoes. Command isn't new for her, but it feels different now. It's better. We've gone up a level. Mentally, she's already in a different place. She's a step closer to that dream of the Iron Throne that we had at the beginning. Basically, she's there. Compare that to the Stark children when they have news or they witness Ned's death. Okay, that's not entirely fair because Cersei isn't a child, but still, I wouldn't say this is a completely normal reaction for being presented with your father's body. She even compares herself to Catelyn's reaction in a moment, and obviously they are very, very different things, even if that's son compared to father still. This cursed tower has too many steps. She had half a mind to tear it down. So some foreshadowing doesn't get paid off in this book, but some does, and this is one of them. It's interesting that they find the hidden passage so easy when Tyrion failed with his own search and Clash. Perhaps he just didn't close it on the way out. He probably wasn't in quite a rush. Or perhaps Jaime put 2 and 2 together. Either way, I bet Varys is pissed that all these years he's kept them hidden. One time he shows someone around, they leave the door open, all his tunnels get found. That is annoying. And we get a few instances, not just here but throughout the chapter, of Cersei calls the guard fools. She wants the moth to fly into the flame. And it's all just feeding into this Cersei above everyone idea. She really has no empathy, no sympathy for anyone else. There is the rest of the world, and there's Cersei. She doesn't really care about one of those categories. But aside from that, here we go. Confirmation. Tywin is dead. Here he is. He's lying right there. After such a long wait, we find out it really was all true. So, wow. Big moment. This huge figure that brought so much misery to the kingdom, the Starks, the Riverlands, his own family, Tysha, of course. He is now just a corpse on a bed, same as anyone else. As dead as his thousands of victims, thousands upon thousands. But he doesn't look the same to Cersei. The power isn't as obvious anymore. So she's facing a type of existential crisis because she's seeing this constant in her life utterly defeated. But worst of all is him not being treated above everyone else anymore. That's what she jumps on. It's the presentation of him. It's him having the arrow still in his body and everything like that. That's what bothers her. We get a lot about Cersei being paranoid here. Note, at the moment, she still suspects Stannis, which is fitting given how Renly and Courtney Penrose died. But she'll focus on him less and less as we get through this book. But in this moment, I think paranoia is absolutely forgivable because, one, there's a secret passageway that the killer assumedly came out of. So, hey, I live in this big, huge castle with who knows what. I already know there's some tunnels that nobody supposedly knows about that could go anywhere. So, suddenly nothing seems safe. It is a fair reaction. Next quote. They sent for me last. The realization made her almost too angry for words. So another common trend we're going to see again and again, how little respect Cersei actually gets around the place in comparison to what she sometimes tricks herself into. She'll say it's because they're out to get her, that she's underestimated, that it's the plotting of Marjorie or someone. She'll never address the fact that it's actually because she has zero people skills. lessons there. She's in minus people skills, which we probably see best with how she talks to Qyburn, a man who seemingly exists purely to help her in this book at the moment. And the fact that she really doesn't deserve any respect. She'll never address that fact. And we're going to see the result of that when everything just completely crumbles very, very quickly when she is imprisoned. That's the reason, because no one actually likes her. They aren't bonded to her in any way. Quick aside here, Cersei mentions Maester Balabar, Maester Frankin. Everyone, hands up if you already lost count of the maesters in this book. There's loads. It's almost as if George really wants to get across their reach and potential influence. So speaking of maesters, let's talk about the meeting of Cersei and Qyburn. You may suffice, she decided. If you fail me, you will lose more than a chain, I promise you. Yeah, you can almost see the lightning outside the window when these two come together. It's the meeting of two evil minds and two respective enablers. Cersei allows Qyburn to do all these terrible, terrible things. Qyburn, in turn, allows Cersei to keep her power, at least for a little while. Although I will admit, I really enjoy reading this relationship, and it's going to be a constant throughout the book, for the most part anyway. As mentioned, look at how Cersei speaks to and treats Qyburn here. Right, fair enough, she doesn't really know him at the moment, but she simply lacks the basic ideals of catching more flies with honey. She does not get that. Being Tywin's daughter, she believes this is the only way to gain any respect. For Qyburn's end, I personally believe his only loyalty is knowing that Cersei will give him what he wants, and he knows how easily he can manipulate her, as he does throughout this book. I'm still of the opinion, eventually, her usefulness will end for him, and he'll repay her for each and every one of these little comments. There is actually quite a lot of Qyburn in this book, so it's a momentous meeting. Lots of people's destinies just changed in this moment. A lot of lives, unfortunately, got a lot shorter and are going to have a lot more pain involved. Important he's in this book precisely. He's the dark side of the maesters. What else are we going to find in that dark side as we go forward with this plot that we know nothing of just yet? Speaking of tough to read passages, poor Shae. Yes, she is here. She is in this scene. Forgotten, uncared for, and eventually dumped unceremoniously. Ugh, yeah, very tough to read given her end. Of course, Cersei doesn't care about any of that in the slightest. She's just worried about optics and has no answer for what she's actually doing there. But Qyburn proves his worth straight away. He steps up. He proves himself the PR guy, the one that Cersei really needs, and that he would probably be a better ruler himself than Cersei. He comes up with the suggestion of Tywin questioning her. Yes, yeah, this is the relationship we're going to see going forward. Shae. Her name was Shae. They had last spoken the night before the dwarf's trial by combat, after that smiling Dornish snake offered to champion him. Shae had been asking about some jewels Tyrion had given her, and certain promises Cersei might have made. Take what comfort we can in Shae at least having her name remembered, if only for this brief moment. This quote does provide some context to what we spoke of a lot about at the close of Storm, about her motivations, especially during the trial, and it seems we were right, our guesses were right. There was some deal cooked up between Cersei and Shae, some promises that Cersei made to perhaps tease the details of Shae's confession out of her, or those extracurriculars that we spoke about. Unfortunately, we don't get quite enough detail here, but it seems we were on the right track. Something along those lines did happen. Something I'd forgot, that Cersei takes the chain, the chain of the hand of the king. Do we see that again? Does that come back? Someone point that out to me. Does she just give it to her next hand of the king? I can't remember. But what I would like is to see Tyrion's reaction if he ever comes across that chain again, because that's obviously tied into a whole bunch of emotions for him. So that would be interesting. Next up is Jaime. He comes out of the tunnel, and this whole interaction is just great. Kevin's also there for good measure. He's the only one having like a normal reaction. Meanwhile, the arguments are already flowing between the twins, and that's only going to continue as we go. Remember, Jaime is in a very raw place emotionally at this point. He'd already made the grand decision to secede from Cersei and Tywin in the last book, but then came Tyrion's tease about Moonboy, etc., and what Cersei's been up to. That's bad enough. That's going to occupy enough of Jaime's mind. But on top of that, at this moment, is copious guilt when he's obviously realised at this point what Tyrion, and by extension Jaime himself, has actually done, what part he played in his father's death. So that's really weighing on him at this moment. And yeah, just this whole interaction really does set the tone for these two going forward in the, I don't know how many chapters they get together. We get a fair few in the first half of the book. And obviously that comes full circle with Cersei's letter at the end. So I look forward to seeing that. Only now does Cersei realise Varys is not there. She speaks of him for the first time. I guess the spiders are always forgotten, aren't they? Personally, I find Varys much missed in this book. I'm a big fan of reading his scenes. For first-time readers, we've no idea what happened to him. When it's revealed Tyrion has escaped, we might assume Varys has gone with him, or who knows. And we're going to have to wait a real long time to actually see him back on the page. Too long for me. I guess for now, I will just rely on the hope that one day we get a conversation between Varys and Qyburn. Because if a conversation between Varys and Kevin is as brilliant as it is in the Dance of Dragons epilogue, just imagine that one. Qyburn and Varys, yes please, sign me up. We end this chapter with the order to kill the guards instead of question or use them in any way. And that is the great example of what I've been talking about, of Cersei's thinking process and just not thinking, basically. Just not going further than the very first hurdle. First thing she thinks of, okay, we'll do that. That's not good news for King's Landing, but it is what we can expect going forward. So good, fairly short intro to Cersei, but brilliant. Yes, we're looking forward to the rest. And I believe there is one next week with Cersei too. For now, we're opening another arc with Brienne I. Let's move on to Brienne I. We open with a quote, "I'm looking for a maid of 3 and 10. A lot of characters have their repeated mantras, and here comes Brienne's. This is her driving force throughout the book, especially in these early chapters, even if she does stray further from the cause later on, or rather, events drag her away. Like Cersei, she's starting off with her goal, with what's important to her. As we discussed in Storm, we know this means a bunch to Brienne in terms of finding Jaime's honour, in terms of repaying Catelyn, and because she genuinely wants to protect Sansa, someone she's never met, she's not related to, isn't going to benefit Brienne in any particular way. There's not really a war to even win. She just wants to protect the innocent girl, because Brienne's the best, basically. There aren't many pure quests or arc that we'll find in this book or any of the other ones. Like I say, she isn't out for gain, not protecting her own family. This isn't going to change anything for anyone except Sansa. That's what Brienne's focus is. Sansa, the person. With so many people in this book see Sansa, or in this series rather, see Sansa as a pawn, as a figure, something to use. Not Brienne. She wants to go and save her for Sansa. And why? Because it's the right thing to do. That is Brienne in a nutshell. Unfortunately, right from the off, we know this is going to be a failed task, or at least a long one. We know that Arya has left Westeros, or at the very least the Riverlands. Brienne thinks she's dead anyway. And we know that Sansa is completely hidden up in the Eyrie under an assumed name. So at this point, Brienne is at least walking in the right direction for the Eyrie and the Vale, but she seems like she's going to the Riverlands. So this is very much the beginning of the arc, walking through the Riverlands and the Crownlands, almost aimlessly. Okay, she has a big aim, but she doesn't know how to get there. So I think most agree the first part of Brienne's arc is the weaker side of the two halves. We won't hit those big story moments until the end, or until later anyway. Although when we get there, we really do get there. There are mental storylines left, right, and centre. Every Brienne chapter is a doozy the further on we go. But we definitely do have a bit of a lull early on, as we mentioned last week. Some of that is because a first-time reader naturally seeks out what's next in the plot because they don't know, so they're hungry for it. As I said before, Feast and Brienne especially get better on reread, likely because we can focus more on Brienne herself having full knowledge of the plot. I think the point of this chapter is to firstly show there's danger on the road of all shapes and sizes, and also just to get us used to being in such a nice person's mind. We don't get a grown character who's like this at all. The closest you can get is probably Ned, and he's a very different character, a lot different for him to think about. So this is really an enigma and an enjoyable one for us. Don't sleep on the fact that Cersei and Brienne's opening chapters are next to each other, by the way, because it's just a comparison of who they are as people. It could not be more opposite. And also bear in mind, in that same vein, we don't often get to be in a knight's mind for POV, at least not so far. Jon has all the same skills, but he isn't a knight. Jaime opens to us only when he loses his skill and ability to be a knight, so it's not quite the same. Davos, yes, technically, but he's not what you immediately think of in terms of classic knight. And Bran, unfortunately, can only dream. Aerys Oakheart will come later, and he's going to be quite the opposite in terms of sticking to oaths, even though he's been charged with protecting a young girl, just like Brienne. And we also have Barristan to come, who obviously is Mr. Knight, so that's to come, but Brienne's first. It's poignant that Brienne keeps referring to a maid when she is technically one also, although we know she's really the warrior at heart. She's not here to represent the maid, she's here to represent the warrior and this noble knight, again, the one that we really don't get much of. The problem for rereaders is that we know Brienne is ultimately going to fail in her quest, and knowing that she's going to go through hell just to reach that failure. It's the storyline I probably want to know about the most in Winds of Winter. What happens with Brienne and Pod and Jaime and Lady Stoneheart and all of that. I can't start talking about that because that's a big rabbit hole. But let's at least focus on one strand of it. What happens after the immediate of Jaime and Stoneheart? Assuming Brienne survives that interaction, does she continue with her searching? Will she Will she still be charged with finding Sansa or Arya because they know Arya's alive? Will she actually get there to one of them? Will she actually find Arya or Sansa? And remember, I believe Arya will return to the Riverlands, so maybe. I still like to champion Daenerys too, but that might be wishful thinking. I just think they'd be good together, Brienne and Daenerys. To focus on Sansa, who is the focus of this chapter, it would be wonderful for both of them to actually find each other. So maybe we should just stick with that. Sansa, that would be an amazing POV for Sansa to actually kind of get to know Brienne, because she'd be in the best position to compare Brienne and Sandor, the two different, very, very different of knighthood, non-knighthood. And I think we can agree Sansa needs a song in living form, which is what Brienne is. She is actually what the songs promise. So that hits on Sansa's growth of looking beneath the top layer, because Brienne doesn't look it, but she is that song. In the early pages, we can see a bit of Brienne's naivety. It's worth checking, Rosby, sure, but if Sansa really was being spirited along to Duskendale and beyond, it's obvious she wouldn't have got far without concealing her hair or her face or even her presence, if possible. She's trying to outrun the crown, in theory, and this is the town next door. So any kidnapper or escapee worth his boots is going to be better at hiding her than that. So it sets the tone that Brienne is really going to have a tough time if this is her search method. But again, got to check, what other options does she have? Asking for Sansa seems basic, but what else is she going to do? She doesn't have the cunning or plotting strengths to really work out a good plan at this point, so she just gets on with the task in the most direct way possible. Have you seen her? Have you seen her? This is what I've got. I need to find her. A couple of quick quotes here that I think really sell who Brienne is and what this arc is going to be going forward. First is this: words were easy, deeds were hard. Yeah, that could be the symbol for Brienne's arc here. Very, very fitting for her themes. She struggles with oaths and how to keep them, etc., etc., and which ones you should even swear to in the first place. But in the end, we'll discover it's the deeds she does, no matter the difficulty, that matter. Second one is this: but elsewhere is a big place. That's just a good line. I really like that. And we're going to get a sense of that during Arya's chapter later when we meet Braavos for the first time. So I think one of people's favourite parts of this chapter and Brienne's whole arc in this book is the inclusion of Podrick, because he's a fan favourite and we get a little bit more of him than we have before in Storm. Really only got hints when he was with Tyrion, and we get our first little hints about him following her early on here. It's pretty impressive that Pod is able to track and keep up without meeting trouble given his age and the fact he's on his own, and he's riding a piebald mare, we'll find out later. Now I wonder, Tyrion was given a piebald mare by Varys, I believe, so did Pod take his old master's horse here and go chasing off after him with it? Could be. Next quote: she found herself wondering whether Jaime had given her this task as some cruel jape. So even early on, even on like day one essentially, Brienne is already having this distrust immediately manifest with double-guessing Jaime here. Even though she's going to come to defend him to herself and others later on, she talks herself out of Jaime doing that pretty quickly. But her life on the road is always one of second-guessing of her purpose, of her chances of success, of her compatriots, all of that. All her arc is just second-guessing. Next quote: she had promised Lady Catelyn that she would bring back her daughters, and no promise was as solemn as one sworn to the dead. So more good lines very early on in this chapter, and more tying into which oaths we should be obeying, etc. Problem here, obviously, Catelyn is now both alive and dead. So Brienne's kind of double-oathed, and that's a really nice snippet of the ending of Brienne's arc. We're 3 pages in at this point, and it's the second time she's been mistaken for a man by whoever she's talking to. It doesn't seem to bother her that much. She probably gets this kind of thing every day, but I think this is another reason for having this chapter, because in a moment when she meets Illifer the Penniless and Sir Creighton, etc., etc., there's just the underlying sexism, and they're not just sat there shouting sexist things in her face, but it's just the underlying foundation of how they relate to women when they ride up on either side, and they say there's 2 swords, not 3, and stuff like that, because they're just so used to discounting women and putting them in these pigeonholed roles that they even with the evidence right there in front of her, someone like Brienne, it doesn't get through to them. So I think that's the other point of this chapter, is just this is what Brienne's had her whole life and she has to put up with it. So let's get on to Illifer the Penniless and Sir Creighton Longborough. Many say that Brienne's chapters are similar to Dunk and Egg, and that makes sense. There's a lot of parallels, and now we're getting to meet 2 hedge knights to hammer that similarity in. And don't forget, Pod is lingering just behind the corner to become Brienne's essential squire, to really make the comparison strong. That's without talking about the obvious descendants things in terms of Dunk and Brienne. I really like that comparison. So we always said about distrust being a big deal for Brienne as we go, especially when we get to Nimble Dick Crab, etc. going forward. That's all still to come. And it makes the quest a lonely place for her. But we'll also find out the specific reasons for such an approach, aside from just good sense. It also keeps us guessing because we really don't know who is trustworthy and who is not. We'd guess that these first two are fine, and they're quite chivalrous, and they're better than most. They don't seem too bad, do they? But who knows? We never know. There's an underlying tension in this whole chapter because where is George trying to misdirect us? Is it, okay, so Cedric, he looks nasty, let's keep an eye on him. But then we never know because Sir Illifer might suddenly come out and try and rob Brienne or anything like that. We just don't know. That's what the road is. Constant danger, constant double thinking. And again, something that Brienne just always has to put up with. And sometimes those choices work, sometimes they do not. I think that really hits home for us when Brienne can't go to sleep even after her watch because you can never be too careful as a loner, as someone in the current Riverlands and the Crownlands, and especially as a woman. Even with these two who do seem quite nice and probably won't do anything, but she's not taking a chance. I've just mentioned Sir Cedric, which I'm not happy about him to say. He also comes along in this chapter, and he seems a lot more shady than Illifer and Creighton. But again, Brienne always has to choose. But we'll come back to him when he appears. Brienne is right about needing the bravery to interact with two people such as these, because this is really just level 1. She's going to come up against much, much, much worse as she goes. And we get a few cool things from talking to these two. There's the, not just in this scene, but as the chapter goes, the Blackwater is talked about again and again in a romantic, kind of glorious way, when we know that's not how it was. It was not romantic or glorious in the slightest. So is this just a knight who was at the back where the fighting wasn't so bad, so that he can talk about this like this? Or was it his way of coping with the actual horribleness? He'd rather glorify and misremember it. Or, as is suggested later on, was he even there at all? Again, who knows? But it's fitting to meet two men such as these early on because broken men are going to be such a theme in Brienne's arc and of the whole book. She's already been warned about them once just here. And these two aren't broken, but they are adrift, just going from battle to battle and seeing what life they can scrounge from this situation. They could have been very easily broken men. Let's talk about swords and shields a little bit because there's kind of a few little mini points we can make about both. First is this quote: "A sword is only as good as the man who wields it." So this is going to come up again in our next chapter with Sam and Jon. Right here, we can look at the quote two ways. The first is obvious in terms of skill, but we can also see a message that a sword can only do good if it has a good person behind it. Otherwise, it can commit all sorts of evil. Luckily, Brienne is just about the goodest person we'll ever meet, so she can do all sorts of wonderful things with her sword as we go through this book. And a lot of people have talked about the importance. There's Eddard Stark's sword doing this good out in the world. Eddard Stark still has this legacy. Tywin, not so much. On the shield side of things, we have this little conversation about Brienne carrying a Lofston shield. And, well, that's not too greatly received. And Brienne's obviously ignorant. She doesn't know what they're talking about here, so, okay, fair enough. But the Lofstons, they are not too great on protecting children, so we can see why she's getting called out for it, given her quest. There's also a mention of Renly's sword, that Brienne took it when Renly died, and then lost it to the Bloody Mummers. I had completely forgotten about that, so I wonder if that's going to show up someday. I doubt it, but it would be cool. And while we're talking about Renly, Brienne is believed eventually about not being Renly's killer. She has that accusation thrown at her yet again. Yes, she swears her oath, and apparently that's good enough, and they just kind of let it go. So that's 2 for 2 when combined with Loras forgiving her as well. And that is really big for Brienne's progression. This is a new part of her life. The Renly stuff is always going to weigh her down, but being relieved even slightly of that pressure is huge for her soul, basically. So as we move forward with this pair, yes, we find they are still decent men. They don't attack her in the night or anything like that. In fairness, Brienne does meet her fair share of good people throughout this story, and that's important because we need to see she is fighting for something, that they still exist. It's important for her, it's important for us, that Tywin's destruction wasn't complete. He didn't just wipe out all the good people. It's not entirely misery and doom and gloom. And Arya had some of that when she was going around with the Brotherhood, and Brienne is going to get it here in this book as well. The next thing we meet coming along is the Sparrows, heading into the city, and we think they are led by who will become the High Sparrow, that Cersei's going to have some interesting interactions later on. It's fitting that Cersei's eventual downfall, politically and physically, is first discovered by the woman who is part of her downfall in love as well. I think we'll agree. It's also important we see this building in the Riverlands and Crownlands rather than just them all appearing in King's Landing all of a sudden in some random chapter. This is the build-up. That's what George is so good at in, providing that foundation. And it also links in with later, as it's Brienne who hears the broken man speech And really, what are all these sparrows and holy men but the broken men and women of the War of the Five Kings and of the Faith? Next up after that, it's the meeting of the merchant and Sir Shadrick. Yeah, I'm not going to enjoy saying that. I'm glad he doesn't last too long. We spoke of beginning and ending links last week, and here we have another less detailed one, because Sir Shadrick is going to turn up right at the end of this book in Sansa's last chapter. And that's why he's so creepy, because he actually succeeds. He does find Sansa. He does what Brienne sets out to do. And he's now in a perfect position to do something. We don't know what yet, but it's a good guess that he's going to try and kidnap Sansa/Elaine. So, yes, yay for disrupting Littlefinger's plan. Huge nay for poor Sansa. Shadrick doesn't seem like the most honourable of people. We do not want him interacting with Sansa too much. No, please. I hope that doesn't happen. So, who knows how that's all going to come off. Definitely one of the more interesting things we're looking for in the Winds of Winter. Just a quick thought of that. Would Sir Shadrick sell Sansa straight to the Queen now that Varys isn't around? Because he mentions this bounty that Varys has put out. He's the one with the gold. I think we can probably just say he's going to sell to whoever has the money. But don't forget, that is all still to come. We don't know the ending of that. There's no real hints. And yeah, like I say, I'm just waiting for that. Now, this bounty that Varys put out, obviously that was done before everything went up the spout with Tyrion. So I wonder if somehow, if Varys did still get to Sansa first, would he stash her, maybe as a potential bride for Aegon, although Arya might be more useful for the current climate, or would he still sell on to Cersei or someone else? Or, again, who knows. Finally, we come to the inn and the close of this chapter, and first off, we get this review of Jaime's fighting skills that Brienne remembers from their short-lived duel. And it's interesting to see Jaime through the lens of someone who really knows, not only that she's experienced fighting with him, but we know she's skilled enough herself for her opinions to matter. That's always a fun duel to revisit. I think we'll always look back on that one fondly. So everything goes down, and Brienne eventually heads off to bed herself, and then she eventually abandons. She walks out in the middle of the night. Now, I think we should note, she doesn't abandon the pair of Sir Illifer and Sir Creighton originally. She could have just done that on the road, but no, she waits until they are in the inn and safe, and they have something to go forward with, because that's just the kind of person she is. Now, for her personally, well, we have this ending paragraph that's very strong in terms of evoking the hero image of going out and rescuing the princess in this land of darkness. Brienne focuses in on her oath, on Jaime, on Catelyn, and most importantly, on Sansa, the innocent who needs a true knight, like we said at the beginning. So, what is there to do? But just go off, set off to deliver. Brienne is going to keep going, no matter what, no matter how dark it is. I think that's the point of this opening chapter as hers. Let's move on to the second half of our podcast today, and we're going to go with Samwell 1. So we're back with our first previous POV, as well as we already know Cersei and Brienne. This is the first POV we've had before. Everything up to this point has been new. We also get our one brief glimpse of the North and of Jon in this entire book, which is very strange given how fundamental that area is to the story, both Winterfell and the Wall. Now, okay, in Storm, we didn't get much Winterfell, we just had Bran out in the north, and in Clash, we didn't get the Wall, we just had Jon up on the ranging, but still, we had tons of Castle Black at the end of Storm of Swords, and now, this is it, this one chapter, so that's very strange. This, and Sam's next chapter, are the most northerly will be in this book by far. Braavos is the next up, and that's equivalent to the neck, the top of the veil, so we're really not used to that kind of geographic limitations. Now, the big thing about this chapter, the one thing that everyone really remembers it for, is that we see it twice. Yeah, when Dance comes along and we see Jon, obviously not all of this chapter, but a lot of the scenes overlap. We get it from Sam's POV and we get it from Jon's POV. And that's pretty much unique in the entire series. We never see anything else twice that I can think of off the top of my head. And so it's a very interesting writing exercise for George. I think he likes that kind of thing. So to this chapter, we start in the library, and it's the last time we go down there for now, so that's a shame. Always tough to say goodbye to these beloved libraries and the secrets they may hold. Consider that last time we started off in the library, we ended up going off on the Great Ranging, but now Jon gets to stay home, Sam, he's soon to find out, is off again. In Storm, Sam started off with one more step. In this early pages, it's one more book. I think he knows which one he prefers, and I think it's also a good instance of George definitely knowing his audience. Yes, just one more page, just one more book. And also that last time we were in the library, it was Jon and Sam together, and they were speaking of it being smart to be afraid before the ranging. So a lot of parallels here, because Jon doesn't want Sam to act afraid. That's being the key, and especially not after everything that they've both been through, Sam especially. Now we're going to come to that conversation later on, but it's just interesting the library functioning so highly in both these instances when Jon and Sam, last time we saw them in the library at Clash, are very, very different, Jon and Sam, to this chapter. And just while we're talking of Jon and how different he is, Sam, right here at the beginning, he can't bear to kill a mouse, even to save his beloved books. Whereas Jon has lost the freedom for such choices. He has to be harsh with his friend in Sam and everyone else too, but we'll come to that. Before that, we have the opening of Sam rubbing his eyes, and it's incredibly similar to a quote about Melisandre in her chapter opening, where she's also rubbing her eyes. Very, very similar writing. I didn't write the quote down, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. There's a hint of a connection between these two when they met in Storm of Swords, and I grow more and more convinced that they will be important to each other again at some point in the future. They kind of feel similar roles, even though they're basically opposites as people. They're two very different bringers of knowledge and tricks to help the big name sword wielders in the war to come. Whether that's Jon, whether it's Stannis, it might be both, but you can see what I mean. And before we leave the library and get to the main chunk of the chapter, there's a few more notes. There's one about Aemon loving the books, but he's obviously lost the ability to read them, which is incredibly sad to think about. But I think it links quite well into what Brienne was thinking about in her last chapter, about Jaime's hand being taken away from him, and how you shouldn't depaw or declaw a lion, as she puts it. And that's very much what we can feel with Aemon, how terrible that must be to have that ability taken away. The other thing that's a shame and is really kind of melancholy is that Sam is almost building a plan to look after this library. He thinks he's going to bring a cushion next time. He's going to save all these books, and he's not going to get the opportunity to fulfill those ideas. And the library, as far as we know, seemingly basically becomes forgotten after Sam goes. So again, that's real sad. But while he's reading through these books, we get the first of many dragon hints in this chapter. Sam starts wondering about Silverwing. Jon will wonder about Melisandre and her waking of sleeping dragons. Jon will also say that Mance is no more royal than he. Pretty heavy on the old hidden dragon at the wall hints in this chapter. They're going to come at multiple points through our reading. When Sam does drag himself out of the library finally, he runs into his old chums, who we last saw enjoying a drink on top of the wall and basically celebrating their seeming victory and getting Jon elected. But unfortunately, the celebrations have worn off and now it's back to reality. And well, we can have it with this quote. "He's Lord Snow for true now. Too bloody highborn for the likes of us." Yes, it's the sign of things to come, with Jon eventually sending his friends away. And, well, you have to get the sense that that wouldn't have happened if Sam had been around. He would have talked Jon out of it, probably. But that's still far in the future. Obviously, we're getting the first instance of that with Sam here in this chapter. And we're going to get much more of Jon when we get to Dance, but the seeds are all being set here of killing the boy and distancing himself from Pip and Gren and his friends. And though I can see the logic, it's tough. He also has difficulty in this chapter in swallowing Stark feelings with the letter that he's supposedly writing to King Tommen. We'll discuss that in a second as well. But which he does in the end, because it's better for the Watch, which is his life now. But it's a tantalising little glimpse of Jon being a really proactive Lord Commander and getting on with preparing the wall for what's coming, no matter the personal cost. They also talk about him switching to archery now, and we're getting the switchback stair rebuilt. So, things are happening here at the wall, but unfortunately for us, we're going to have to wait to get the full experience of such. So while that is all kind of doom and gloom, we do at least get one fleeting instance of some good old Pip and Gren comedy, which we're not going to get that much more of, unfortunately, so enjoy it. I'm sure you know to which I refer. Now, while Jon is promoting archery, he's also spending a lot of time on his swordplay, that's pointed out, because he wants to improve. He knows what's coming, he knows he needs to be the best. He needs to be able to protect his people. And even without that, we know how important it was for him in the first place, his dueling and his swordsmanship. That's just part of who Jon is, even when he first joined the Watch. Still, it's even more important now. Later on, we're going to have Jon looking at Longclaw and really describing it in depth. So last chapter, we had Brienne looking at Oathkeeper, and both of them echo sentiment about a sword only being as good as who wields it, although Jon approaches from the other angle, the opposite angle to Brienne. With all this talk of swords, Sam wonders about him being a shield because he's not a swordsman. How can he be a shield if he's not a swordsman? Well, that's fitting because this is already a chapter about different types of shields. We're going to talk about paper shields in a moment. And Sam, he has to realise that he has worth to the Watch, even if it's a different type, even if it's his knowledge that is going to shield humanity, not his swordplay. That's what Jon is trying to get at and make him realise. On his little trip, Sam also notes that the King's Tower has a king in it again for the first time since, well, it would have to be Jaehaerys the first, you would think. But then again, Jon was still in it not so long ago, so who knows. Next big part of this chapter is Gilly. She comes up next, and here we don't know about the life-changing, soul-tearing news / command that she's just had from Jon. We're not going to find that out until halfway through the book, so even at the end of this chapter, we can only assume she's upset because she's being sent away, possibly. And obviously, when we actually come to Jon 1, I think it's Jon 1, in Dance of Dragons, we'll see the whole conversation play out as a whole and how harsh Jon has to be and how terrible it is for Gilly. So the emotional weight is going to only increase after we've read that bit. So for a reread, we're already here. We already have that emotional weight. And I think that's the key part of having to see this twice, even though we actually see the conversation between Sam and Jon twice, not Jon and Gilly. It's just that fact being hammered into us, not once, but twice. Everything Gilly says here hurts so much more when you know the context. And we're hurt for Sam also when he finds out. We're hurt for Jon having to command this type of thing to try and help everyone. Although we should note, this business of swapping baby identities and taking them far away is very Neddish of him. And of course, we feel for Gilly. She's already completed such major feats, ones that she really had no business even dreaming of, let alone doing. And all of it just comes to this horrible moment for her. That's terrible. Yet, as we find out later, even this she manages to get through somehow. And I think Gilly's strength is not nearly discussed enough for this book. The way she carries this burden and somehow gets on with it and can bring herself to care for this other child and not just go crazy and start scratching people's eyes out. I don't know how she does it, but somehow she does. And just consider that her child originally should have been sacrificed for evil. Somehow she got out of all that. She marched through the cold and through the dead and got over the wall and everything else, only for her to have to sacrifice him for good instead. Now we come to what this chapter really is about, the meeting between Sam and Jon. And the first thing I'm going to mention is the title of the book that Sam is carrying. He mentions it here. It is Dragonkin, sounds like Skyrim, Dragonkin, being a history of House Targaryen from exile to apotheosis. I don't know if that's the word, but that's what I'm going to say. With consideration of the life and death of dragons. Quite a mouthful. So if you're like me and didn't know what apotheosis meant, well, don't worry because I looked it up. It means becoming a god. So is that Aegon the First? I don't know if that makes sense, or some connection to Baelor maybe? I don't know. It's a hell of a title. What I do know is we get a ghost sighting. Ghost is here, and you remember how much we enjoyed his coming back at the end of Storm of Swords. Well, here he is, just chilling out with Jon behind the armory. Brilliant. It's our lone sighting of a direwolf in this book, I think. Okay, we might get Nymeria dreams. I'm not sure if we do actually get them in this book or not, but for being awake and being present, this is the one direwolf we see for the whole book. So, we've talked enough about different signs that this is a new era for Song of Ice and Fire, and this is one of them because, again, like the Starks, the direwolves are pretty key fundamental parts of the Song of Ice and Fire, and suddenly they ain't around. We get them for like a page. While we're talking about animals, the ravens also getting harder to ignore. He says blood this time, which is important for a chapter with this subject matter, considering Jon's end goal with switching the babies. He also seems to be reading the book alongside Sam. Now that's very interesting, I like that. If we join it with Dance, we know the ravens have left cold hands in high numbers when he's walking along with Bran, and we actually get to meet the three-eyed raven, who is very clearly Blood Raven. I've just read that chapter on my personal read, and I forget how, it is laid right out there. That's definitely Blood Raven sat in the tree. So I wonder if this is the best chapter for Feast Dance comparisons. Not only do we get to see the chapter, obviously, in both books, but just the extras as well. So the first part of the conversation between these two is about this paper shield with the Lannisters and Jon not wanting to go for it, basically, because he's still clinging on to his old role. It's Jon Snow, Jon Stark, the one he could have been. He doesn't want to do that because he remembers what the Lannisters were like when he first met them. He obviously remembers everything that's gone down between the two families since, but that's conflicting with his oaths and what he's actually supposed to be doing, like we spoke about in the Brienne chapter. Now, luckily, Sam is on hand to give good advice on the paper shield issue, which I won't go through all of it with you now, because basically it ends up with Jon conceding. So, and it's just a shame that Jon doesn't keep Sam around, because he would have been much use going forward in situations like this. But there we go, alas alarms, I suppose. We also have Sam remembering that he's keeping his word on Bran, tough as that is. And again, oaths. We're talking oaths. Next to Brienne's chapter, and she's the big oath keeper, isn't she? Not just sword alone. So it also relates back to Sam's question on lies for good causes. He's doing it to Jon. He doesn't realise until later that Jon has done the same to him and Gilly. Lies for good causes. It's death and destruction I want to bring down on House Lannister, not scorn. Yeah, I think that sums up Jon's feelings here. And eventually, he is going to give in to that scorn his family desires. And it will cost him, not specifically to House Lannister, but one of their allies. And yeah, we know it's going to cost him. But again, we're going to have to wait for that quite a while. There's also some mention about Stannis and that whole storyline, that whole plot not going forward as we would have hoped. The North is not rallying to Stannis. That's going to relate into Davos early on and White Harbour and everything. That's something else we've got to wait for, but we get the hints here that, yeah, it's not as easy as Stannis would have hoped. And just while we're talking of Stannis as well, Jon, he has some rather blunt questions for Sam about the others that we're going to come to in a minute, but just the way he says them makes him sound more and more like Stannis. So I wonder how much time they've been spending together, or were spending together. I have a few little notes for you here. Let's go through them quickly. Here's one quote for you. I would sooner take off Mance's head myself. He was a man of the Night's Watch once. By rights, his life belongs to us. So, well, he doesn't get to do that, but he is going to take Janos Slynt's instead, not too far in the future from when this chapter is. There's also the first mention of ice spiders, I believe, here in this conversation with Jon. 2 in one chapter, in fact, because the other one is going to come and dance. It's actually the same dialogue. So this is our lone mention of ice spiders, which spawns a whole movement. I think it is, anyway. If it isn't, it's the first since Old Nan, probably, in Game of Thrones, or maybe early Clash. So I could well be wrong. And there's also just a little bit of talk about really, really old books, which is just tantalising. I want to get on, bite those old books. I want them so bad, but we're going to have to wait, unfortunately. Let's get to some of these blunt questions that Jon is asking. Here's a quote. Did you find out who the others are, where they come from, what they want? Now, that's actually not all that blunt considering, but it is important because this is the first time anyone has really posed these thoughts at all, with any seriousness at least. That's why Jon is so key as Lord Commander. We spoke about it in Storm. He's the one who's the best of both worlds. He knows about true threat. He's the one in the position to do something about it. If Janos Slynt had been elected, he'd be just shrugging off their existence at all. Whereas Jon is not only considering them as an enemy, but who they might be beneath that. If Jon's the first to question, I wonder if that means he'll be the first to get an answer. I'm going to have to wait. It turns out all this talk of paper shields and what Stannis is up to and old books is more just a delay for the actual purposes of this conversation, Sam being sent south to become a maester. So we really had a whole chapter off of maester in Brienne's chapter, but now it's coming back with force. We have some of the negative connotations that we got in the beginning chapter as we find out Sam doesn't want to be a maester. Now that's a puzzle. That's a surprise. From everything we know of Sam, a maester is the ideal role for him. And if we thought Jon would eventually replace Gior, we can assume Sam would have eventually replaced Aemon. That's just how it looked to be. But then we find out why. Yes, we have a very uncomfortable, terrible passage with Sam remembering some more of his childhood at the hands of the evil Randyll Tarly. Evil. Another way of putting it. We would have thought we'd hate Randyll enough, but clearly not. This just adds on to it. Sam's memories, these instances of being chained to the wall, it's just wildly barbaric. Pure torture. So it's no wonder that Sam has turned out the way he has. We already had enough evidence for that, for hating Randyll, like I say, but even more now. And you'd think Randyll might have been happy about the maester idea way back when. Sam makes something of himself. It's something accepted that many big houses do, even the Targaryens. And it gets him out of the way so Dickon, the big strong lad that Randyll supposedly prefers, can inherit. So everybody wins? Well, obviously not, because we instead discover that success is nothing to do with Randyll's criteria. It is literally about how manly you can be. Physical strength and nothing else. Just horrible machoism everywhere. And there's also that hints about Randyll being unhappy about serving the Tyrells because they were once stewards. So if he thinks anyone in a life of servitude is not worth thinking about, well, that fits into the friends in the Reach theories, doesn't it? Yeah. But unfortunately, as much as Sam doesn't like the idea, he is going. And I do love the culmination of Jon and Sam's arc here, especially that big order, the command from Jon about Sam not being allowed to think of himself as not brave anymore, because it's just not true. From the beginning, Jon has gently guided and nudged Sam along in order to make him a better person. But like we say, now he's full on ordering, again, to help his friend. And Jon, giving due to all Sam's accomplishments, even if Sam doesn't himself, is just good reading. Now, I understand Jon's logic of needing a maester. Again, connections to the themes of the prologue. But he also understands that he needs every man now, so that makes this decision a little more confusing. We can see Jon is more focused on the martial aspects of the war than any other, but he knows Sam can provide a lot of good up on the wall as a thinker, a researcher, a de facto maester like Clydas. Perhaps Jon is just unaware of how long it actually takes to become a maester. It's not exactly a career path he would have spent a lot of time thinking about in his childhood. But then we also really know it's just a vehicle of getting Aemon and Mance's child away, of gifting Gilly with someone who might make her happy on this terrible, terrible journey he's sending on. And also gifting Sam a career he would like, some time with the woman he likes, and probably saving his life, because again, Jon knows what is coming, and he knows Sam isn't a fighter. He wasn't there for all those battles. Now, I'm not saying Sam would have died in any of those, but it could have been dodgy. In that way, I suppose, as confusing as it is, we could look at this as one of the last acts of Jon prioritising a friend over his wall duties before he really starts killing the boy. Now, to end here, let's talk a little bit about Aemon, and here's a quote from him. "There's an inn on an island in the Honeywine, where I used to go when I was a young novice. It would be pleasant to sit there once again, sipping cider." This is just one of 1,000 tragedies we know of Aemon never making it back to the Honeywine and what we can assume is the Quill and Tankard. But also it just provides us a bit of a time warp. We've just had examples of young students doing exactly this. So that allows us to travel back, imagine a young Aemon doing exactly the same. Similarly, we can imagine these young students now as old maesters, not as old as Aemon, I doubt, but still old. You can just see the two ends of similar career paths or life paths. Aemon warns Jon about the Jade Compendium. Now, we know later that the passage is about the sword, Stannis' sword, not being warm and only bright, Lightbringer we're talking about. Same as the conversation he had with Sam at the end of Storm. It's one of those occasions where it would have been a whole lot easier to just tell Jon outright, but I guess it's just too much of a teacher within Aemon to do so. But he's also just trying to impart the importance of knowledge for the war. This isn't going to be won with swords or bows alone. You need books, Jon. You need thinking. And unfortunately, both of your best thinkers are walking out the door. I think Aemon knows that. So let's just hope Sam gets back there. While we're talking about leaving and getting back, let's close with the snowflakes and their hair comment. Yeah, we all know that one. We had a reminder of it in Storm of Swords when Jon was remembering his Winterfell childhood prior to the vote, and it comes back now. And it's a callback to the feeling of this being a permanent goodbye. Permanent so far in the story, they don't see each other just yet, but for all they know, for all Jon knows, this is it. It's a long, perilous way down south. It's going to take a long way for him to come back up, and Jon doesn't know if he's still going to be around because there's this army of the dead coming, so who knows? It really hits Jon hard because that's what happened when he saw Robb, and that was the last time. Robb was his best friend then, Sam is his best friend now. Tough for Jon, tough for Sam, and I'm still going to say real tough for Gilly. We should talk about her much more often. But we'll leave the chapter there and move on to our last one of the day. It is Arya I. As much as we like Sam, he is a very new POV in comparison to Arya, so this is really going back to our roots here. We've had 5 chapters of Sam to this point, but we've had 28 Arya chapters to get comfortable with, so this is someone we really know and we've really missed. Except she's in a completely new situation, one we aren't used to at all. This is not the Arya we knew before. It's one of freedom, relatively, that's the clear thing. We've seen her with Yoren, at Harrenhal, with the Brotherhood, and then with Sandor. She's normally starving, half the time she's on the run, always in the middle of a blazing war and danger around every corner. Not so much now. Okay, danger still present, sure, but not the same, and definitely not the horribleness that she experienced before. Now she's going to be in a city completely removed from said war, one of its own society, hierarchy, and many, many different cultural elements that she's never seen before. And it's quite unlike anything we've seen before as well. Ironically, the closest so far is probably Old Town. Now, the structure of Braavos, the makeup as it's described, makes people normally think that it's like Venice because of all the canals. But a lot of people say it's actually more like Amsterdam. That's due to a myriad of reasons, the tall houses, other stuff that I won't bore you with. Now, I'm lucky enough to have been to both Amsterdam and Venice. I can say I put my vote to Amsterdam. I think people are correct there. Either way, whatever it's supposedly based on, it's a big intro. Braavos is going to be very important to the storyline of this book, going forward in Winds and Dream as well, especially if our prologue theories turn out to be correct. And we know it has a big place in history also, so it's worth considering. The other thing we should consider is that this is the first time we visit one of the three cities, save for the very brief glimpse we got all the way back in Dany 1 of Game of Thrones in Pentos. And they're really going to enter the focus of the saga now, especially in Dance. Even more importantly, this is the first time we visit Essos at all in someone other than Dany's POV. Soon enough, we'll have Tyrion, Victarion, Griff, Quentyn, and Barristan, and Sam in this book as well, but it's Arya who kicks off the trend, safer for Daenerys, and gets us going on the western coast of Essos. It's also the first civilization that Arya's been around since she escaped the Red Keep and King's Landing. That didn't go well, but Braavos clearly has its stuff together way more than King's Landing ever has. So that provides us with a good opportunity to see how Arya's changed since then, and just the differences in these two cities. So with all that in mind, it's a big world-building chapter, clearly. It's just as new as Old Town was, and has far more to point out if we're being honest. Some of it's going to be very important to the plot going forward, some of it just great background world building. But thanks to Fire and Blood and others doing their theory crafting, we have even more connections and guesses to make through ancient and modern history both when it comes to Braavos. And just one more note here before we get to the text. Just 2 more Arya chapters after this. This is all we get. Just 4 total going forward. 2 more in Dance, 2 more here. Very strange. So George is throwing us a bone early, sure, but wow, that's really going to take some getting used to for us, isn't it? Okay, let's get on with the text. So we open with Arya on the ship that we saw her boarding at the end of Storm of Sword, the Titan's daughter. She's still on the journey, still crossing the narrow sea, coming to the end of her journey. And the beginning focus is very much on this Star of Home, which is quite good for Arya's themes because much like Sansa, also at the end of Storm, home has always been the target for both sisters really. Indirectly perhaps for Arya because she's been heading for Riverrun first, but ever since Eddard's fall, both of them have been trying to get back home, and both ended up on a ship they thought might help them out. Unfortunately, it's a no on both counts. Sansa has been redirected through trickery, Arya just by lack of choice, she just can't get home. Now she's returning to someone's home, but it's not hers. This ship is called the Titan's daughter, I'm about to go past the Titan, but okay, one daughter is coming home, but unfortunately it's not Arya. And that fact forces her to reflect on the idea that home is nowhere now, that she doesn't really have one. She's just being dragged from place to place, and this is just the next place on the list. But before she was dragged, now she's actually going herself, so she at least gets to enjoy the freedom that we mentioned a second ago. It's not the freedom she specifically wants, the freedom to go home, but freedom's better than being dragged, isn't it? Same for Sansa, unfortunately. She's going to kind of get the idea of freedom, but we know really she's still kind of a prisoner. It's ironic, really, that Bran, who was the last one to actually be at Winterfell, is the one sibling who has actively tried to get further away rather than return like his sisters. Still, we know from Storm of Swords that Arya really wanted to get up to the wall to be with Jon, kind of bypass home, because he's really the only option left. And I think that's one of the more common wishes for any A Song of Ice and Fire fan. I'm not sure there could be a more endearing reunion at this point in the series. I couldn't put anyone else above. Arya and Jon would be top of my list for reunions. But feel free to correct me if you have a better suggestion. It's big alas alarms, obviously, for what could have been if Arya had reached the wall. Huge amounts of joy, of course, if the two actually got to see each other. But importantly for the plot, Jon would know that the Boltons have a fake Arya. That changes everything that happens at the end of the dance, doesn't it? Assumedly, he'd try and get that information to Stannis and the other Northern Lords, perhaps. But who's to say he'd be leaved? And then what happens? Would Jon allow Arya to stay on the wall, given what he knows is coming and the political state of the Watch at that time? But then again, where else can he send her? Where is safe? Really, not many places. I have a feeling she would prove herself more than useful anyway, and we could have a meeting with Melisandre. She'd probably even get on well with the wildlings. Endless possibilities, really. So yeah, a big alas alarms. Even if she didn't get there, outside chance on the way, she gets blown to Skagos and meets Rickon or Davos instead. But no, that's not what we have. We have Arya coming to Braavos. Here's the first quote for the chapter. I don't need any friends, so long as I have Needle. So that's a cool line, but a sad line. Arya is a survivor, first and foremost. And this situation, like we said, is way better than 90% of those she's been in recently, ever since she left King's Landing. So she's trying to make the best of it, thinking about Jaqen and even Syrio being from this city, already hinting at the importance of the unknown ways of the world. And those two are certainly fan favourites and two of the more interesting side characters. So if we can find out more about them and their history, we're all in for it. But even with that idea, with that notion, she still doubles down on not needing anyone. She's fine alone, she's in control. All she needs is her beloved sword. It's important to focus on that now because she's going to be giving it up later on, so we need to highlight Needle straight away. Then again, the other way is to see it as something sad. It's sad to see a young girl cast off humanity in such a way and only put true value, true friendship in a weapon. And for all that confidence, Arya is still at something of a loose end. This boat journey is going to be finishing soon, and then what? Her only previous goal was to get to Jon. That's not possible, so what else is she to do? And she can't come up with an answer or a wish for this star because she has no idea what she wants and what she's walking into. What is this place that they're about to dock in? Instead, she relies on what has always been her greatest strength, being able to talk with people of all backgrounds and stations. She talks to the crew, she learns from them, she picks up little tidbits. Considering how much of that she's going to be doing later on in the city, pretty important. And again, very different from King's Landing Arya, where she really struggled initially with that side of things. She thinks back to tales of Old Nan when they start thinking about the Titan, and that leads to a rabbit hole including Lewin and Sansa being at Winterfell until Arya physically stops herself, or mentally stops herself. It's the second time in 2 pages she started thinking of home, and the second time that she stopped herself short and made herself remember that they are all gone. She's really hammering that point into herself. She's now even quantifying it with all men must die, because looking at it as destined and unavoidable perhaps lessens the pain. Not thinking about it at all is even better for that, but even if she won't think of them, she and we both know she's going to continue feeling them, feeling that loss, even if she puts it to the back of her mind for now. And even if Arya does attempt to give up herself and her painful past in the coming chapters, the end sentence of this chapter and future events also tell us that she never lets go. Much the same as Sansa again. Things might get pushed to the background, but they're always there. You can't ever get rid of that starkness. Next quote here. And salty isn't highborn either. So we're already playing with the importance of names and identities, being someone, changing your whole history, etc. It's going to be big for this Faceless Men arc that we've got coming. Lots of names to come from Arya. Lots of names she's already had. And so it's not a surprise that she's ready to leave Arya Stark behind. Look at what she's been through. We can't blame her. And she's already perfecting this talent of not letting details give her away. She doesn't ask about Godswood and the old gods because Salty wouldn't know. But again, that thought only leads her back down the rabbit hole of reminding herself that all her family is dead. So we really get this sense of melancholy and pain, and we have to remember that the Red Wedding isn't that long ago for her, even if it is for us narratively. The pain is still very fresh. She's still incredibly, incredibly wounded about all this. So how best to deal with all this pain? Well, the solution she comes up with is her beloved list. But even that is much changed, and she's getting further and further from those names with every passing minute. So it's getting harder to lean on those now. Next up, we get a great description of the Titan, and Arya not realising its size or that it was going to make a huge noise is pretty descriptive of her arriving in Braavos full stop. She doesn't know what to expect. This is all new, but she's already getting intrigued. No, I love the Titan, personally. I wrote an entire short story because of the Titan. The Tumble Titan, if any of you are interested. I'm sure you know how to find it by now. But anyway, back to Arya instead of myself. She makes herself brave as they pass through. She's relying on herself again. This is a new city, new sounds, new massive statue, but Arya is a strong wolf and she will get through it. And once we pass the Titan, we get onto Braavos itself, and even more cool descriptions, lots of world building, all the islands and the fact there's no walls and all this stuff that is just cool for us nerds to soak up. And clearly, Arya has never seen any place like this, and neither has the reader, like we said at the beginning. We'll get more and more of these passages through the chapter as we go, so in that sense, I guess you could say this is a travel-loggy chapter. Sure, okay. Especially for first-time readers who don't know which of these features are going to turn out to be important or that they can disregard. And in fairness, quite a few have already been left by the wayside for now, but I don't think this is as slow as a travel-loggy chapter. I think this is just soak it all in. I think we enjoy this. As we go further in, again, more world building, more city describing. We have the tall houses I said about. That's why a lot of people think of Amsterdam. Yes, I certainly do. And we also get some important tidbits in there for later, such as the different harbours, or the fact that everything is stone and there are no trees. Daenerys theorists like that note, I know. She also echoes our own thoughts about this place completely outdoing King's Landing already, much as the Westerosi might want to lord their capital. Is this some of George's best world-building work? Yes, I would say it is. Makes it incredibly interesting. A lot of us would want to visit, I think. Even with quick notes about broad canals and the differently decorated bridges, it's very, very intriguing and most definitely a setting of possibilities. This just seems like a place where there could be a lot going on underneath the surface, and we want to explore it. I especially want to just point out the Sweetwater River, because I'd personally forgotten that. That's pretty huge, the system they've got of bringing fresh water down into the city. Again, just on another level to the places we've been before. As we go further, we get descriptions of the Isle of Gods and all the different temples. There's mention of the Sea Lords too, so we're keeping that Syria connection that might be important later. And Arya is really only able to connect with the Red Priests at the moment, but she's having her eyes open that there are hundreds of gods all over the world that she's never even heard of. And this is a young girl, who has travelled around. She has been educated and has more life experience at 10 or whatever she is than most people do in their whole lifetime. Yet she still has no idea about the majority of the world. So again, there's just this opening of possibilities for both her and us. Let's refocus on the boat for a moment. We've got Captain Terrace, and he's clearly eager to not have too much involvement with the Faceless Men. He's fulfilled his duty of getting Arya here, and he's hoping that's enough to just keep him in the good books, but he doesn't want to get too close. This is a shame for Arya, because it's rare for her to stumble across any situation she might actually like or want to stay in, and every time she does, it gets taken away from her, which is the same here. She doesn't even get to say goodbye to her friend, which is unfortunately another common occurrence for her. So that was goodbye to the main boat. Now she's been in the little dinghy, I guess, with Yorko, and he has this goodbye as well. "You know my name," said Yorko from the boat. "Yorko Terrace, Valar Dohaeris." That's interesting. I wonder if there's significance to someone's name in Braavos or in dealing with the Faceless Men, because that phrase isn't used again of having to say you know someone's name before saying Valar Dohaeris. Pretty apt for Arya though, for whom names are so important. Or, well, you could even say Theon. He's a bit like this, you know your name. I wonder if that will come back. Now when it comes to actually disembarking from the boat and facing this huge city that she has no clue about, Arya immediately discards the salty identity for a strong wolf persona, all the better to face what is in front of her. We're already getting really good at switching masks depending on the situation. What I'm trying to tell you is Arya has played Majora's Mask from the Zelda series, that's what I'm thinking. And again, clear connections to what's going to be going on later for Arya and her identity. Let's quote here as we approach the ending of the chapter: "The doors are watching me. Yes, we have another weirwood door. Weirwood mixed with ebony and complete with a moon. Makes me think of the moon door. I'm sure you're the same. As we've said 1,000 times, if Bran or someone else can ever figure out how to watch through this kind of weirwood, the unconnected weirwood that's been fashioned into something else, well, this feels like it'd be a pretty damn important location to be able to see out of." Now, the door itself opens when Arya says Valar Morghulis. So does it open for that password specifically? Is it a coincidence? Is it because Arya has the Faceless Men coin? Don't know, but it definitely puts me in mind of the Black Gate in terms of needing something specific to pass through. So she goes inside, and it's a pretty creepy place to find herself in, but also a great link to the rest of Essos and to some of Dany's early journeys, because we see the Goat of Qohor, we see a Dothraki horse, etc., etc. I'm sure there's more, hopefully I haven't got that wrong. Old Town might have been the gateway to the rest of the world, but now we're really in the rest of the world. This is kind of the centre, because to be fair, if we want to look at a map of the known world in terms of how far we've gone in terms of readers, so from Karth, that's the most southerly easterly, to the Frostfangs above the wall, that's the most northerly-ish we've been, Braavos is basically along the middle of the line between them. So I'm going to say this is the middle of Planetos for us, for the story. Arya comes along to the pool and those drinking the water. So for first-time readers, and for rereaders to a certain extent, that's just damn confusing. We've got no idea what's going on. It all comes pretty quickly. We don't really get time to reflect or wonder what's happening here. All we know is it's dark and creepy, and yet another thing Arya shouldn't have to be seeing for her age. Although it is pretty heartwarming when she helps the man drink, because she just wants to help people. Next we come to the kindly man and the waif. For now, we've got no reason to really suspect the waif or anything else, but the kindly man is different. He knows her names are all fake, and she already, like we said earlier, she already has a whole bunch to list off, and he knows which one is true. Pretty creepy. Oh, and on top of that, he has a skull face with a worm in it. But this is Arya, and she's in her brave wolf persona. She's got the wolf mask on. So brave that she tries to eat the worm and prove she belongs. And it clearly works. I think this more than anything proves there is no one quite like Arya. So she's accepted in, and an entirely new avenue of her life begins. One which we still do not know the ending to. Guess it's going to come fast and thick. We do have 4 more chapters in Braavos for Arya, but I don't think they give us too much clues of where she's going. But then we also have the Mercy pre-release chapter, and yeah, lots of theories flying left, right and centre. But for there, I think we will leave it for today. The most important thing is Arya has found a direction. She was looking for home earlier, and I would struggle to call the House of Black and White a home for anyone, but it's what is going to serve Arya that purpose for at least going forward for the rest of the story as we have it. I think the most unfortunate thing is this is the thing that's going to take some getting used to. We have to wait 18 chapters until the next Arya 2. Yeah, it's just rough. To be honest, we have the 3 chapters that come in Arya are pretty evenly spaced out. So we have this one, the next is the 22nd chapter, and her last, Cat of the Canals, is chapter number 34. So pretty evenly spread, and yeah, this sucks for us Arya fans, of which I definitely am one, that we're going to have to wait for so long. But we will discuss that when we come to it, I suppose. Let me tell you about what is coming next week on part 3. We will have Cersei II. We're already back in that mind because her chapters are just going to be so frequent. Then we get Jaime I. That is going to kick off. Brienne II, we're back there. And finally, Sansa I, heading to the Eyrie. Much like we have today. We finish with Stark Sister today. We're going to finish with one next week too. So we hope you'll join us there. In the meantime, look after yourselves. Please consider looking back on those resources I mentioned at the beginning, because you really should be. And other than that, I thank you for coming and joining. We shall see you next time.